Here we are at the northern end of the Biggar Burn at Carwood. You can see a group of buildings on the hillside in front of us, ranging from Carwood House at the top of the slope down to a building half hidden by the spur coming down in front of us, which is the site of Carwood Bone Mill. To get the water to the power wheel, the geography of the landscape was taken advantage of, and a dam was built high up on the Biggar Burn, and from there a lade hugged the contour, which we can see in front of us, and took the water roughly half a mile to the site of the water wheel at the bottom of the slope beneath where the bone mill is situated. Now, another 20 feet had to be raised in order to get the power from the wheel up to the machinery in the mill. And so quite a steep articulated drive shaft had to be erected. And this time the agricultural revolution was well advanced, and there was a great demand for bone meal from the agricultural community. Animal bones of many descriptions were taken and crushed. There were rumours as well that other types of bones were also used. Immediately after the Napoleonic Wars, there was certainly talk of bones being imported from the European battlefields into England. Whether that trade extended into Scotland or not is known, and there's certainly no evidence of it having happened at Carwood Bone Mill. This is Biggar Mill, and this is one of the early mills from Lanarkshire. It was established probably in the 13th century. At the time of Malcolm Fleming in the late 1300s, the mill was certainly in position at that time. He was paid dues by the miller of Biggar Mill to allow the process of milling to take place at this point. Now, the building that we see at the present time was rebuilt by Alexander Watt in 1796, and so what you're seeing here is dated to that time. The extension to the right hand side here is a 19th century building. This was the threshing barn, which was later added to the mill. Previously, this building is thought to be the site of the walk mill of Biggar. Now, a walk mill takes its name from the verb to walk, whereby foot power was used to tighten the weave of woolen textiles before they were ready for the garment industry. Later, this of course was superseded by water power, and water power was used to make this process the viable concern that it had become by 1700. At this time, there is a testament from Thomas Cosh, and he had left his worldly goods that he had acquired as a result of his manufacturing process here at Biggar Walk Mill. This is the line of the lade which fed the water into Biggar Mill. It starts about a mile upstream to the north of here at Pursullins. There were two dams in fact at Pursullins, an upper dam which also fed the threshing mill at Pursullins Farm, and a lower dam which regulated the flow into Biggar Mill. So it enters along this line. There was a sluice gate at this southern end of the lade, allowing the water to be regulated when it was needed to flow into this northern wall of the mill in order to power the machinery. This is the wheel pit of Biggar Mill, and the noticeable thing that although the wheel has disappeared, the mill shaft is still here. The noticeable thing is that the stonework around about the shaft is of considerably better quality than the rest of the random rubble that the mill was constructed from. And that's because of the tremendous forces that were applied by the trundling of the wheel constantly rotating and putting pressure on the building, and therefore stonework of a much greater quality was necessary basically to hold the building together. This is the entrance to the kiln, where the grain would have been loaded through this door into the kiln to be dried out. The floor immediately inside this door would have been a perforated floor to allow the heat from the furnace beneath to rise up and dry out the grain prior to it being ground. This extension to the mill on its western side is where the grain drying kiln would have been. In Scotland, most of the grain that was harvested was too damp to be put directly into the mill, and therefore it had to be dried before it could be effectively ground. And so the building that we see here has a small lean-to attached to it. That was the coal shed. The coal was taken into the mill itself, into the kiln, and from there the grain entered the mill at the road side, at the left-hand side of the building, as we can see here, was laid out onto a floor with perforated tiles. The heat from the furnace rose up through these perforations and dried out the grain. And you can also see rising from the roof of the building a small chimney known as a granny, and this was to allow the fumes from the furnace to escape from the building. Have been taken from the mill, and they're now a nice feature in the garden in front of the mill building. Each of them is composed of different segments. You'll see this one here has 4 segments, and the slot in the middle where the shaft would have come through to allow the millstone to rotate. And you can also see that it's a stone which has very large inclusions of quartz crystals. It's a stone which came from Mill Hill in Ayrshire near West Kilbride, and the fact that these quartz crystals have very sharp edges meant that grinding grain was a more effective grind to be able to come up with the correct degree of separation of the husks from the corn which went to make flour or whatever other product from the milling process. Okay. This similarly is a composite millstone. It's composed of 8 pieces, trapezoidal pieces, that are constructed round about an octagon in the centre, and again composed of this quartz conglomerate from Mill Hill in Ayrshire. This is the site of the Green Well, and this was an opening to allow water to be able to flow to Biggar Brewery, which was another water-powered industry in the town. The well itself really took its name from the exit point from a pipe which took water from further up the burn, roughly 50 metres north of here, piped it along to this point here, where it then entered an open lane. So the open lane would have hugged this eastern side of the burn, heading down towards the gasworks wall, and from the far end of the gasworks wall crossed the burn in the form of a small aqueduct into the brewery, which is still standing, has now been converted into houses. We're looking now at a building at the corner of Station Road in Biggar, and this was where James Watt moved to in the early 1800s. He set up his business here. One of his many talents was in woodworking, not just in metal engineering. And from this point here he had a water-powered joinery works. The water was taken from the Biggar Burn, standing beside the road, across to the other side of the road to power the machinery in an outbuilding to his house. Also from this point here, another lathe travelled along the side of Station Road down to Cloghall Farm, and Cloghall Farm had a threshing mill, and so water power was taken from this point as well. We're now standing at the lower part of the Biggar Burn. In fact, by this time it's become known as the Biggar Water, flowing through the Biggar Gap on its way to join the River Tweed down at Broughton. And although the valley as you see it now is dry, it's full of sheep and cattle munching away quite merrily, At one time, this valley would have been flooded for most of the year. It still floods in the winter time, of course, but for most of the year it's dry, and the improved pasture that you see now is doing its job quite nicely. Up until 1839, this was not the case. The valley would have been flooded for most of the year, and it was then that the Murrays of Heavyside asked James Watt to build a device to try to drain the Biggar Gap of its floodwater. And so James Watt came up with the idea of a double wheel, became known as the Heavyside wheel, a small inner wheel of 12 feet in diameter, which was powered by water diverted from the Skirling Burn. The Skirling Burn came from Skirling via a lade. The last 100 metres was piped in a culvert and issued on the hillside in front of us. Then descended down the slope to the Heavyside wheel. There the inner wheel turned, and this in turn turned a larger outer wheel of 26 feet in diameter. This had a series of buckets attached to it. They raised the water from the valley floor, from a drain which had been cut in the valley floor, raised it up to 2 metres above its original level, and from there it was able to be discharged further down the valley, thus drying out the lands of Heavyside. Yeah, the Lost Mills of South Lanarkshire, newly published, covers 171 mills from Crawford to Rutherglen, and it was the culmination of 10 years of research with the Clydesdale Mill Society, excavating some of the mills, but a lot of historical research, from census returns to historical maps. Yeah. And it gives a good historical perspective on the milling legacy that we have, not just in the Biggar area, but throughout South Lanarkshire.